Betty Greene, an eager learner. Betty need not have worried about the amount of time the women in her bay would spend in the single bathroom. They were all kept so busy that when they got back to their bay at 10 in the evening, all they could do was collapse onto their cots, exhausted. And they would groan as they rolled out of bed when reveille sounded at 6 o'clock the following morning. Before long, they all sported PT, pilot training suntans. Deep brown tans from spending hours on end in the sun, except for the raccoon-like pale rings around their eyes from the goggles they wore during training. After breakfast, roll call, and barracks inspection, the remainder of the morning was spent in flying practice and instruction. During the afternoon and evening, they spent time marching on the drill field, competing on the obstacle course, and using the Link Trainer, a simple flight simulator that allowed pilots to pitch and turn in response to the way they moved the control stick. On top of all these activities, the women spent 5 hours a day studying math, physics, meteorology, aerodynamics, electronics, navigation, military and civilian air regulations, and engine operation and maintenance. Each subject required a heavy workload, not to mention lots of tests. Along with the others in the women's flying training detachment, Betty found herself studying during every spare moment she had. Although the women were stationed on a military base and were treated as if they were in the Army, technically they were not. They were all volunteers, and this led to some important distinctions between them and the men in the Army. For one thing, they were not bonded to the military and could quit at any time. They were also required to pay for their own uniforms, and Betty, along with the others, handed over $100 for her cap, goggles, jacket, and parachute. And unlike the men, the women had to pay the Army for their room and board, which cost $1.65 a day. This daily amount was deducted from the $150 they were paid each month. Many of the women complained about the unfairness of the system, but Betty didn't care. She had her sights set on something more important than what she was doing right then. She intended to learn as much as possible, get all the flying experience she could, and when the war was over, somehow use it all to help with missionary work. The experience she gained at Avenger Field was more than she could have hoped for. Within 2 weeks of arrival, she was flying solo in a PT-19A, a 175 horsepower open cockpit training airplane that cruised along at 90 miles per hour. Her instructor insisted she double check her safety belt before each takeoff. And it was not long before Betty learned how important his advice was. One morning, as she stood in line waiting for her turn to fly and memorizing a page from her navigational textbook, a PT-19A taxied down the runway. As Betty glanced up at it, she did a double take. The instructor was sitting in the rear cockpit seat, but the front cockpit was empty. The woman who had gone up in the plane just 15 minutes before had vanished. Only the earphones dangling over the edge of the cockpit gave any hint she had been there. Betty looked around in a panic. Other women gasped at the sight. What had happened to their fellow pilot? The instructor climbed out of the airplane and jumped to the ground. "It's always a good idea to double-check your safety belt," he said dryly. "This woman didn't, and she fell out while doing a spin." Betty's heart raced. This could have happened to any of them. The good thing is she kept her wits about her and remembered to pull the ripcord on her parachute. "She'll be fine," the instructor added, obviously enjoying the shock and suspense he had created. The pilot was fine, just as the instructor had said, but it was only a few weeks later that another incident occurred, and this time it did not have such a happy ending. The basic training phase of their program had finished, and the women had moved on to instrument and night flying. One woman from Betty's Bay was scheduled for a night flying session. After dinner, she climbed into a BT-13 aircraft. Betty happened to be walking by and listened as the 450 horsepower engine throbbed into motion. Everything sounded normal, and Betty did not give it a second thought. However, the plane never returned to Avenger Field, and its burned wreckage was found in a cattle pasture at daybreak the following morning. Both the instructor and the pilot were killed in the crash. As a result of the accident, Betty vowed to be even more careful while flying and to diligently keep her eyes on the goal of learning all she could about flying aircraft under various conditions. She also thought more about missionary work and how her flying might help. One day, she decided to write down her thoughts on the subject and submit them to Power, a magazine for teenagers, published by Scripture Union Press. Betty thought for a long time about what to say, and in the end started her article with a brief description of what she did each day. She followed it by saying, "Why do I want to fly? Probably for the same reasons hundreds of you would like to, but mainly because I am looking forward to being a missionary and think flying is going to be very useful in the work of spreading the message of Christ." The article was published along with a photo of Betty in her olive green coveralls. Little did she know that these words would begin a chain of events that would define the rest of her life. An edition from his InterVarsity Christian Fellowship's magazine read her article and asked her to write an article for the magazine about what she hoped to do when the war was over. The article was published in late spring 1943. As the hot West Texas summer settled over Avenger Field, the pace of training heated up. By now, the woman had advanced to flying the AT-6 Texan, an advanced single-engine training airplane. It was the first plane Betty had flown with retractable landing gear, and its 600-horsepower engine allowed her to cruise along at 145 miles per hour. Betty loved the throb of the powerful engine and practiced landings and takeoffs until she could do them perfectly every time. The threat of an unsatisfactory test flight hung over Betty as it did all the women in the training program. When a pilot performed an unsatisfactory test flight, she was handed a pink form with a large U for unsatisfactory stamped across it. The pilot was then given a second chance to prove she could perform the particular procedure. This flight was called the E-Ride. The E stood for elimination. If a pilot failed the second test, she was dismissed from the program and within a few hours had packed her belongings and left the base. At times, Betty and her fellow pilots would line up for roll call, only to find someone was not there. The pilot had washed out on the E-Ride and left, too humiliated to even say goodbye. This created a constant tension on base. Exams had to be passed in all subjects, and every flying technique had to be perfected in only 6 months. With all the work involved, time flew by, and before Betty knew it, it was September 1943 and graduation. Graduation day was particularly hot. So hot that the tarmac stuck to Betty's boots as she marched in formation to the quadrangle. She, like all the other 85 graduating pilots, was dressed in the unofficial Women's Flying Training Detachment uniform, wide-legged khaki pants, short-sleeved white shirt, and khaki boat cap. The band struck up as Class 43W5 stood to attention for inspection. Keeping her head facing forward and as motionless as possible, Betty scanned the makeshift bleachers to her right and left. She knew many of the other women had their parents and siblings in the crowd, but Betty's family was not there. It surprised her to feel a lump in her throat. She had been so busy with her final exams that she hadn't had time to think about what graduation would be like without anyone she loved looking on. Soon the speeches began. Captain Elmer Riley, the flight school director, stood to praise those who had made it through the program. He talked about how reliable the women were, how he thought they worked harder and were more responsible than the men, especially when it came to buzzing the nearby towns in their airplanes. Everyone laughed. Jacqueline Cochran was the last person to speak. She told the women pilots how proud she was of them and pointed out that although they could have left at any time, only 42 of the original 130 women had washed out. This was a 1/3 dropout rate, no higher than the men who did not have the choice of leaving simply because they'd had enough. The sun continued to beat down as Jacqueline Cochran finished her speech. Then, as each woman's name was called, the women walked up the concrete ramp to the dais to receive their wings and diploma. Jacqueline Cochran welcomed each of them as a fully fledged WASP, or member of the Women's Air Force service pilots, as the Women's Flying Training Detachment was now called. As the silver wings with W5 on a shield in the center were pinned onto her shirt, Betty thought about the future. She and two of her roommates, Anne Baumgartner, who would go on to become the first woman to fly a jet plane, and Carol Jones, had been posted to Camp Davis in North Carolina. It was not until the three of them had arrived at Camp Davis a week later that they learned why they had been sent there. In July, 25 women Air Force service pilots from the previous class in Houston had been assigned to the camp. Betty was being added to the group as an extra pilot, while Anne Baumgartner and Carol Jones were replacing two of the WASPs who had been killed in flying accidents. Jacqueline Cochran had investigated both crashes, and although her report was classified, rumor was that sugar had been found in at least one of the crashed airplane's fuel tanks. Most people thought there was probably a man or group of men on base who resented the idea of using women pilots, though no one was ever charged with sabotage. Upon their arrival at Camp Davis, the three women were allowed 30 minutes to settle in before they had to report for their first briefing. The room they were assigned to was much like the one at Avenger Field, and Betty guessed that the rooms were probably the same on every military base across the United States. Betty was putting her clothes in a locker when she glanced out the window. Two men were walking past the barracks. One was short and blond. The other was tall and had reddish-brown hair. Betty's mouth dropped open when she saw him. She dashed out the door to catch up with the men. She could hardly believe her eyes. "Bill!" she yelled. "What on earth are you doing here?" The tall man turned to look at her, a stunned look on his face as he laid eyes on his twin sister. Betty had only a few minutes to question him, but she found out that Bill had just been assigned to Camp Davis for an officer's anti-aircraft gunnery course. The two of them promised to find each other at dinner that night, and with a huge smile on her face, Betty hurried off to join Anne Baumgartner and Carol Jones for their briefing. Before the end of the day, Betty knew exactly what her job was going to entail. The job had three parts, all aimed at giving the men on the base ways to practice fighting aircraft. The first part of the job required Betty to fly her plane along specially coded routes, while radar operators on the ground tracked the plane so they could give its exact location at any given moment. The second part of the job involved flying over the base at night, allowing the men to practice their searchlight techniques and get the feel for how to spotlight enemy aircraft flying overhead under the cover of darkness. It was the third part of the job that boggled Betty's mind the most. She would pull a large fabric target behind her plane while the men on the ground who were training to use anti-aircraft guns would practice their aim by shooting at the target. This target practice sounded fine until Betty learned they would be using live ammunition. She only hoped their aim was good.